You're listening to 15 Minutes of Flame with Robert Phoenix.
Try this. There now? Tommy, can you hear me? Tommy, can you see me? That's a little bit better, right? Compelling radio, isn't it? Hi. Finally. We're here. Hey. Robert Phoenix broadcasting to you live from Fredericksburg, Texas. And I said I would be back to do some Friday FARcast, and that is true. And today we're going to get into the life of Nicholas Roerich with my good friends Krys and Steve Crimi from North Carolina and Logo Sophia Press. And we actually did this recording last week. And I could not, I've been traveling a lot. I had a lot of personal stuff to deal with over the course of the last few Fridays. And I've just not been able to get to the starting line for the Friday FARcast. Well, that's going to change here over the course of the next few weeks as we ramp up and get ready to relaunch 15 Minutes of Flame, which will be happening as soon as Mars goes direct. Yes, I'm living the chart. That is what I'm doing. So that means new website, new social media tools, you name it. It is being worked on as we speaketh, or at least as I speaketh, to you with what's happening out there. It's been a while since I've talked in this format. I've been doing the Sunday night live streams for the most part. I had to take a break for a couple of weeks because both Sunday nights were quite intense while I was away. I'd just come off of teaching one weekend and a ton of readings the next weekend. So after I did all that stuff, I really didn't feel like getting on the air. And I mean, I could have, don't get me wrong. But I didn't feel like getting on the air and jamming on more astrology for another couple hours. I was a bit, I wasn't burnt out, but it was a long weekend. Hard work, but it's good to be back. It's good to talk. There's a ton of stuff I could talk about and start riffing on because it's been a while. A lot has taken place since I last did a 15 Minutes of Flame. I think that was the show where I actually had some unkind things to say about Tommy Robinson and what he was doing. It cost me quite a few viewers or listeners, to be honest with you. I have more thoughts about Tommy Robinson, but I'm not going to get into them right now because guess what? We've moved on. There's something else to talk about. There's something else to move our attention towards. Now it's the hashtag walk away. the walk away movement. By the way, I just had a new video come up with Emily Moyer over on Off Planet. So if you're an Off Planet person or you want to see some of the stuff that Emily and I did, it was on MK Ultra and Sports and a bunch of other really high strange stuff. That's over on offplanetradio.com. You can find them over on YouTube. And it's about almost 2 hours of me and Emily riffing away on the high strange of the times that we live in. So I've been laying low, been hanging out here, traveling, teaching, reading, doing a lot of readings for people. That's been great. Really enjoyed that. I've broken through the ice. Next level stuff. Feels good. I had an interesting 4th of July. And there were a couple of things that I wanted to just kind of touch on and talk about with 4th of July. 4th of July is a strange day in a lot of ways. Like it is, 4th of July is kind of like a family holiday. You hang out with the family. You do a barbecue. Maybe you take the family down to the water, or you take them to the park or the city square or wherever, and you go and watch fireworks with the family. And if it's not a family day, it's certainly a group-oriented day. It's the family of the United States, which is another extended family in some ways. So here I was in Fredericksburg on 4th of July. No family to speak of, really, at this point. So I'm like, well, what the hell am I going to do? Well, I rode down to Main Street here and I watched the parade. I watched the 4th of July parade. And you can imagine that a 4th of July parade in Texas is something special. Let me tell you, it is. If you want to get your Americana on, there's no other better place than to watch the 4th of July parade in Texas. Because for the most part, fireworks are also legal here. You won't see them during the 4th of July parade, but you'll definitely see them at night, both individually in terms of a group experience. So after that, I got on my bike after I watched the parade and I rode through town and I stumbled upon a house that was having a party. There are a lot of chairs in rows, tables with food. Usually when you stumble across something like that, it's either religious or it's political. In this case, it was political. And it was the Democrats of Gillespie County, which is the county that I live in. So I decided to roll on over there and see what they were all about. Got myself a little pork tenderloin, a little fruit salad, a nice little glass of local Chardonnay. Yes, this is a wine region, even though most of the wineries here get their grapes and wine from other parts of Texas and California. Nonetheless, there are a number of wineries. So I sat down and I listened to the candidates for various offices. There was a youngish guy, probably in his late 30s, early 40s, running for attorney general on the Democratic ticket. He sounded reasonable. Didn't sound like your typical histrionic, progressive, liberal Democrat. I listened. When he was done, I walked up and I asked him questions, and he answered them fairly well. Following him was a guy running for state senate. He's a guy. He's wearing a baseball cap. Again, he sounded reasonable. He was giving voice to these ideals that the Democratic Party had at one point in time, which was standing up for the little guy, the little gal, the common guy, the common gal. That's what he was doing. Sounded good to me. Enough of the identity politics is starting. I thought to myself, I might be witnessing grassroots rebirth of true democratic values in the state of Texas. And then the women took to the mic. And I saw a very different version of the Democratic Party. And this is not to slam women or their political beliefs terms. I was there as an observer. So there as a witness to see what these people were offering in terms of their vision, how they were going to make Texas blue, the blue wave that was going to crash all the way from the shores of California and cascading and washing upon the hill country of Texas. The first woman seemed fairly accomplished. She was running for state comptroller. She talked about numbers. She talked about her experience, which was, again, fairly thorough. She was a CFO for Dell Computers. She was running incubators and startups in Austin. Seemed like somebody you could trust with money and a balance sheet and a bottom line. Look, a comptroller is not a sexy gig. A comptroller essentially is a highly qualified bookkeeper for the state. In many regards, that position is kind of apolitical. You're dealing with money. You don't make any decisions around money. You know where the money goes. So what do you want from somebody like that? You don't really care if they're Republican or Democrat. You want competence. You want somebody that can keep some good books and make sure that money isn't being wasted or isn't being absconded. She was fine. But then the next three women who spoke were the epitome of what I would call identity and activist politics. And if that's where the Democrat, to me, it was really interesting. I mean, I saw a split. I saw a split between the men who had a more centrist, logical, rational point of view, and the women, for the most part, who were much more emotional, playing upon this idea of the state of the country and how bad it is and how bad the politics are in this town, and it's the Republicans' fault or it's the Tea Party members' fault. And oh, by the way, we've got to stand up for things like the children and what's happening on the border. And I began to listen to this stuff. And my blood pressure started to rise because they're speaking into a vacuum. They're speaking into a void. It is a void that is populated by a few small believers. They're preaching to the choir in a void. And they'll get some immediate gratification when they come up with a talking point that is more emotional than it is really well thought out. And so that will encourage them, that will engender them to move forward and say, I'm doing the right thing. Because in that moment, I just got something really nice in the feedback loop because I was talking about something emotional and I was talking about kids and I was talking about rights and I was talking about moral responsibility. And I got a round of applause. Well, just because you got a round of applause, it doesn't make it right. I'm sorry. This woman kept talking about their moral responsibility. And the way that she talked about it was that she believed that her moral responsibility was not just her moral responsibility, but the moral responsibility, that it was the distilled version of something that should be applicable to everybody. And to me, it represents, to a large degree, one of the highest forms of arrogance. To believe that your moral responsibility or your moral justification or your moral causation, whatever it is, because you champion it and it hits a few talking points that everybody else in attendance claps for, that it is the moral responsibility causality in formula for everybody. And it's just not the case. And herein lies one of the main problems that we have to deal with. Their moral ground is higher. And it's not. It's not higher. There's never any discussion about what that moral responsibility is. I'm sure if I pressed her on the subject, she could have laid it out in very specific, and I would say likely very cliche terms as it relates to the ideology of the Democrats, the progressives, and the left. I was not impressed. Now, I didn't go to the Republican Party. I wasn't invited. Well, I wasn't invited to this one. I just stumbled upon it and invited myself. But it was not that impressive. I have to say, she was not that impressive a candidate. Because, number one, she had to think, which isn't always a bad thing, but that kind of pause and reflection is really good for like a spiritual talk. Like if you're listening to somebody like Krishnamurti, the old Krishnamurti recordings, the silence, it says something. Because silence is profound, right? But in that situation, you don't want silence. Because in that situation, it's like you can see the wheels grinding. What do I say next? What do I say next? And then she ended her little speech on a chant. And I felt like I was at a rally in Berkeley. It was not that nostalgic, to be honest with you. But she was actually more palatable than the next person. And the next person was a judge. Like this woman was a judge. She's a practicing, she's on the bench here in Texas. She's Latina, 5'4". She's a powerhouse. But again, the scope and the breadth of the arrogance was stunning. Absolutely stunning. At one point, she actually said to everybody there that she was the most powerful person present. She meant it. And she didn't mean it in the sense that, oh, I'm a powerful person because I know who I am. No, I'm a powerful person because I'm a freaking judge. And I'm powerful. And again, it was like the arrogance. Are you kidding me? Like, was she being honest? Sure. Like on one level, yeah, of course. She was more, she had rank. But that's in the rank of this world. And this is where I think people get really hung up on stuff. There are people in that audience that were just as powerful as her in different kinds of ways. But in her Capricornian full blast moment, she was more than happy to let us know how powerful she was. And then I realized that she was an activist judge. That she would rule ultimately in favor of whatever was sprouting out of her ideological garden, which in this case is Democratic. And it dawned on me in that moment. I'd never had that kind of light go off in my head. That having judges aligned with any political party is dangerous. And I thought to myself, if there is a really plausible application for AI, it would be adjudication. Like, I think that AI could actually play a role of adjudicating cases. And I know that sounds crazy and far-fetched, but if the AI was programmed within parameters to deal with state law, constitutional law, and then case study law, whatever that was or is, and then that was it. It was based on those parameters. I actually think AI could be a fair judge. Now, whoever's programming the AI, well, that's a whole different story. At the end of the day, I would trust an AI more than I trust this judge. It's crazy. It's crazy. And then finally, this other woman got up and she read some poem. It was sort of this. She was older. You could tell she was kind of like a Democratic Party maven. She'd been around, Gillespie County politics for quite a while, and Democratic politics. I don't want to say her last name, but it was an interesting last name. She got up there and she was wearing this kind of, red, white, and blue Americana sort of summer dress, older, like maybe late 60s, early 70s. She read this poem, which was her mashup of, the tired, huddled masses and her version of what it's like today. She mashed it all up. I mean, it was remotely interesting on some level. At least she would do that. But then all the claptrap and all the cliches and all the talking points started to come out. And I'm not in favor of destroying the Democratic Party. I think it's actually a good thing that there is an opposition party to the Republicans. But I'm clearly not in favor of what the Democratic Party has become. It's become the Communist Party. Let's be clear about that. But really, I wouldn't say it's more importantly, but one of the insights I had was that when I saw those two guys talking about Democratic politics, they were level-headed. I mean, they were level-headed. They were solid. They were centrist. And then the women were not. And they were really emotional. And there's it didn't play for, with the exception of the comptroller, she had her head on her shoulders, but it didn't play for anything that was inspiring, enlightening, and oh wow, they might have learned a lesson in 2016. They kept talking about 2016 like it was, Auschwitz or Buchenwald or Hiroshima. Well, there was a lesson to be learned there. And apparently part of those people aren't learning the lesson. They're doubling down. And then I realized this divide that we have in our country that is represented by the right and by the left is a schism between the masculine and the feminine. And that the men, theoretically, on the Republican side, and I'm not a cheerleader for the Republican, and I'm not some MAGA head, although I would love to see America become a great country. I'd like to see all countries in the world become great countries. Wouldn't that be cool? Every country can become great in their own way, even if the country is really small. Right? Switzerland is a small country. Djibouti is a small country. Let's make them all great. And do we have to be great at the exclusion of other countries? I think that is the $64,000 question in the 21st century. Anyway. I saw this distillation between the masculine, which is thought-based. If whenever you hear the refrain from conservatives or Republicans that liberalism is a mental disorder, I would disagree with that. I would say liberalism is an emotional disorder because it is divorced in some ways, in a lot of ways, from rational thought. And on the other side, in terms of the Republican mindset or the conservative mindset, it's logic, it's ideas, it's maybe the ideas aren't great ideas, but it's logic, ideas, it's rationality. And then the challenge is that it is devoid of emotion, right? I mean, that's the big flashpoint at the border. The Republicans are devoid of emotion. They're cold. They're heartless. They're fascistic. Meanwhile, the left is overflowing with emotion. And if we want to bring the two worlds together, it's not necessarily about the ideas of the Republicans versus the ideas of the Democrats. It's about bringing together and having a synthesis of rational thought with emotional content. And that is often typified by the relationship between the people from Mars and the people from Venus. And that's not to say that there aren't emotional men. That's not to say that there aren't rational women. Please. But as a collective, as a group energy, as a group identity, this is how this has been sorted out. Our political divide is not necessarily a political divide. It is a sexual divide. A divide between the sexes. A divide between the rationality and the mind versus emotion and heart. So I bum rushed the mic at the end, and I gave a little speech about fluoride and how we need to keep fluoride out of the water here in this lovely town. And I got a round of applause, except for there was one woman who looked at me, and she had her arms folded, and she was just shaking her head. Who are you? What are you doing here? I don't agree with this. It was funny. And then I got off my bike, and I hit the road. But I sat down. I listened. I was there. I wanted to see what they had to say. And by the way, the roast pork was pretty good. Speaking of pork, I was watching some reruns of Bourdain last night. God, I didn't even get into the Bourdain stuff, did I? I saved that for the live stream. Maybe by the time I get back on the air and do the Flames, Bourdain piece will have withered away. But the latest news on Bourdain was that originally he was thought to be worth $16 million. Now he's only worth about $1.5 million. How does that happen? Where did that money go? I have two words, Randy Quaid. One word, Star Whacker. Is that one word, Star Whacker? Can we make it one word, like Bushwhacker? Bushwhacker is one word, right? Star Whacker. The Bourdain rabbit hole runneth deep. So I went out to watch the fireworks on 4th of July, and I almost left. I went out to this airport, and I almost left, but I was there to watch Americana. There were a lot of people out here in Fredericksburg at the airport watching the fireworks, and I wound up actually having a pretty decent time. And then I saw something really interesting. I saw, like, I'll save it for a different podcast. It's not for today. Hey, let's get into what Steve and Krys and I were talking about last week, and that's Nicholas Roerich, the mystic, the mystery man, the mystical mystery man of the early 20th century. a fascinating character who came out of Russia, was not a Bolshevist. He was a mystic. It was actually kind of, I wouldn't say he was kicked out of Russia, but he clearly did not want to have anything to do with what happened after the 8th, was it the 8th of March 2017? No, I think it was the 9th. It was actually the 9th of November in 2017. It started on the 8th of March. Interesting. So Roerich eventually, he was a painter and an illustrator. I think he had some connections with being an architect, married a woman. I think her name was Helena, if I'm not mistaken, and she was a mystic like Roerich who loved to go into places like Tibet and Nepal and Afghanistan and India to have meetings with remarkable men, maybe spiritual masters. He became attracted to theosophy and Madame Blavatsky and that whole crew when he moved to England after he left Russia, and eventually he migrated to the United States, where he became pals with Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace being the vice president of the United States during the time of Roosevelt. And it is through Nicholas Roerich that a lot of the symbolism on our dollar bill was placed upon it. So Steve and Krys had an interest in the life and times of Nick Roerich. They love his paintings, and they wanted to talk about him. So be it. And we did. We got into his life. Now, I'm going to replay this on YouTube, and I did capture this with video. So some of the paintings, which a lot of them are really quite something. Roerich was a very good painter. And we talked about some of the paintings, and they'll be on the YouTube broadcast because I was doing some screen grabs and stuff like that. So why don't we get into this? Let me turn this over to Steve and Krys, and this was our discussion from last week about the mysterious Nicholas Roerich, one of the most influential people of the 20th century that you may or may not have known about. So you're listening to the Friday FARcast. I'm Robert Phoenix. I'm back in the case for today, and I'll be back on Sunday night for the live stream, and I'll be back in 55 minutes and 25 seconds and wrap things up. So here are myself and Steve and Krys.
of his paintings, which are large, and they just have presence to them. Just being in their presence is just a wonderful experience.
And a collection of Tibetan artifacts, bronze statues and cases and what have you. And you pretty much have very free run of the brownstone where you can walk at your leisure and go through the different rooms. I guess it was a home at one time. And so all the rooms have the artwork displayed very nicely, and it's on a human scale. So it's not one of these very stark, modern, cold museums. It's very warm and welcoming, and you feel quite comfortable going through, and really beautiful little treasure.
Isn't that where they shot part of Ghostbusters?
Did they? I don't know.
I don't think so. And there's another building where that was shot, and I don't think it was there.
Okay.
I think I know what you're talking about, but I forget the context of that offhand.
Okay.
So he was born in Russia. His father was German, and I just found out that actually his father comes from a line where one of his ancestors was head of the Templars in the 1200s.
Really?
So that was interesting.
Wow.
The woman he marries, Helena, who is kind of the one that gets him interested in theosophy and a lot of spiritual matters. And, back in that time, spiritualism was huge in Russia and America, everywhere. People were doing seances, contacting people on the other side. And she apparently came from Tartar royalty. So that was their lineages coming together in Russia. He was born in St. Petersburg. So, I guess one of the things that I'd like to just mention is at that time, a lot of the artists were going back and looking at the folklore and the tribes and older things. He was also very interested in archaeology, and and this informed his paintings. So there's this one particular painting that kind of depicts this called The Idols. And what it is, it's a stone circle with 3 or 4 totem poles in the middle. But what's really interesting about this painting is that it looks like it's encircled. The stones that are the circle around these totem poles actually look like monks or something standing very still, because they're right next to each other, and it even almost looks like there are like cow skulls on top of the heads of these stones.
Oh, I thought they were monks. Okay.
And no, they're actually another stone circle, but this sort of so my interpretation of looking that is that that all these symbols and things of the past is what you're trying to uncover, and they're surrounded by this sort of wall that we can't get through because we become modern, because we've abandoned interpretive thinking, symbolic thinking. Of course, the symbols are everywhere in Nicholas Roerich's work, and once we got into modernism, which you can kind of trace to the theory of relativity, where the Newtonian world breaks apart, where the 3D world kind of breaks apart for a lot of artists, and then you get into further and further, abstraction in art. So that's one of the. So that particular painting, shows me he's sort of interested in that past, and he goes and he travels widely, especially throughout Tibet and Mongolia, the Gobi Desert, and all these places. And, Gurdjieff was known for doing the same thing, and that's right about the same time. So there was this understanding that there was something lost, and that maybe these really obscure places in these, vast Asian plains held something still there. Gurdjieff claimed to have found it in a place called the Sarmung Monastery, where he spent some time, and then after that he also ended up being in Russia, and then left at the Russian Revolution. Same thing with Roerich. He did not agree with that. So so you've got all these sort of interesting things, but he's always just looking back into the past, and you have a lot of the people in music also looking back. People like Rimsky-Korsakov and Stravinsky, of course, going into folk songs and things like that to try to sort of revivify contemporary music, things like that. So one of the things that he's noted for, Roerich was for the set design and the costume design for the Rites of Spring. And I did a little research into that story because I had always thought that there was this huge uproar when the Rites of Spring was first performed in Paris, and the uproar was. I thought it was always the music, which is very, very dissonant and driving. It's like most people might know it because it's part of Disney's Fantasia movie. They do a section on the Rite of Spring. I think I keep on saying the Rites of Spring. It's the Rite of Spring, and it has this pulse to it, kind of thing. But the story actually was that what really freaked out the crowd in Paris were the dancers. And so you can see, you see the picture of the dancers, they're wearing what are basically drawn from Scythian folklore. So these are all sort of tribal people. They look also Native American. They're all wearing these sort of caps, which back in those days, in the ancient times, tended to indicate that someone was initiated.
So like the conical caps? Are you looking at the red
Yeah, they're almost like they're sort of variations on what's called the Phrygian caps, which are noted for people who are initiated to a certain level would get to wear these particular caps. And of course the church fathers stole all that. Your bishops and your cardinals wear these huge hats, and of course they're initiated in, let's say, another way, not necessarily the ancient way.
Can you see this image, by the way? Can you see it?
Yes,
I do see it. So
nice and clear.
So what freaked out the Paris audience was the fact that these people were like, it was against all the rules of ballet. The feet were pointing in, the arms were at their side, they were stomping, and it was not elegant. It was primal. And again, these people are trying to go back and connect with this sort of old primal connection to deity that had been lost in the West, with the famous declaration of God is dead from Nietzsche. And, and to me, that's saying he didn't say God doesn't exist. He said God is dead, which meant that God as an operative force had left, and as the West abstracted away into, more and more complete materialism. So what happened at this premiere was that people were like yelling and screaming at the dancers, so nobody even heard the music apparently. And then it apparently was not as wild and horrible as people thought, because Stravinsky and Nijinsky, who was the choreographer, considered it a success. And so it was mostly in Paris. And again, it was this sort of, going back to Gemini things, there was these two sections of the audience, and there was the traditional Paris, theater goers who were expecting, Swan Lake kind of la-di-da, pretty stuff. And then there was sort of Cocteau and all the sort of Paris avant-garde, who were there for this kind of stuff. And apparently there were basically, almost fights in the audience between these two factions.
And what about the woman in the balcony who smacked someone who... You told me that story this morning.
There are a couple of stories. Yeah, there was a woman in the balcony who smacked somebody, and then her consort had to challenge the other guy to a duel the next day. This is crazy stuff. So anyway, so So he was Roerich is in the middle of all this stuff. But at the core of it is this spiritual quest, and this spiritual quest takes him, on journeys through Tibet, and then we get into a couple of other interesting things. If you want to get into the Wallace bit of it,
let's give people a visual of what he looks like.
Yeah, please do. So he looks like a wise old sage.
Can you see him?
Yeah.
Quite beautiful.
That's a nice shot of him. I'm not sure if that's a self-portrait or that may have been done by his son, who was also a painter.
What always struck me as fascinating about him was how much he reminded me of Lenin, like when they were young.
Yes.
They were almost like spitting images of one another, and he actually couldn't stand Lenin.
No, exactly.
And he was no fan of the communists.
No.
In fact, didn't they offer him like a position, like Minister of Art or something like that?
Yeah, but it was right, but it was because of he understood that the context of it was that he wouldn't have any power, he wouldn't be able to do anything. So he left because there was somebody else who was like the higher minister that he knew it was just would have turned into a propaganda thing, which of course art did for them, and then later for us with the CIA and abstract expressionism, art became a propaganda thing for him. But on the other hand, though, he needed them to go on his expeditions, because actually his travels were incredible, because he would start in India and move up through Mongolia, and up into Russia, and then like back down through Tibet. I mean, his itinerary was just astounding for that time. And so when I don't think you get to do those kind of travels at that time without at least saying you're going to be, some level of a spy.
Oh, I would totally agree. Or there would be some kind of agreement that not just being a spy, but collecting, things, whether they're artifacts or plants. And he actually does that with Henry Wallace when they go to Mongolia.
Right. So there's two main trips. One of this is Russian trip, and then there's this second trip. So Henry Wallace was under FDR. He was the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, and then later vice president. He also ran for president, also in 48. I believe. 48. I guess it was 48. As a sort of third party candidate. But Wallace and FDR were both 32nd degree Masons, and so they had that aspect of it. Wallace was, I think, more into this spiritualism and things going on, and so he read Roerich's books, and then at some point Roerich came to the United States and set up the Roerich Museum was set up in New York, and he traveled. He loved Maine because that reminded him of home, and of course loved the mountains out west.
Isn't that where Solzhenitsyn wound up, in Maine?
That's a good question. I don't know.
I think that's where he went after
he got out.
After he got released from the archipelago. I think he wound up in Maine. Might be not Maine. It's somewhere in the Northeast for sure.
Yeah, I think you're right. I've only read one of his books. The the Something Circle, the Inner Circle.
There's an interesting period for Roerich after he leaves Russia, and that's when he goes to London. And London's kind of this intermediate period, right, before he goes to the U.S. And he hangs out with people like H.G. Wells and Christmas Humphreys and Rabindranath Tagore, and I think his son married Tagore's daughter, right? Isn't that?
I don't know that, but I know he was very, tight with Tagore, and so he was reading. So at that time, all the Indian philosophy was coming out, so he was reading a lot of those people too, and getting himself familiar with that.
And that's where he gets really switched on to theosophy too, right? Pretty much.
Right. I think his wife Helena gets really interested in theosophy. I think they do seances, and then of course it's the connection with Blavatsky is that they end up forming something called Agni Yoga, which and so Krys can explain that a little bit.
Well, Agni is the god of fire. So in Sanskrit, Tejas would be the element of fire, but Agni, Agni, is the god of fire. So this is something that with a fire, actually, it burns away all the dross of your spiritual life, where, whatever is holding you back. So this, apparently, they got interested in this because they were getting readings from this guru, who was the guru of Blavatsky, but not a physical guru, is my understanding. And his name was Morya, Morya. And then so I guess Helena, had some very powerful spiritual dreams and visions. And then in the 1920s, they started receiving these messages from Morya. And there were messages for her, and there were messages for their students. So they had a small group of people. And I think, which curiously was all Jewish except for the Roerich family. So they were getting these messages from the guru Morya for the students in the class. And then Nicholas Roerich would take down the notes on a big sketch pad, and he would transcribe the speakings from Morya to the students. And then there were also speakings from Morya for the Roerichs themselves. And then those were kept in a separate notebook. And ultimately, they set up these centers. So they set up the one in New York City, which was on Riverside Drive there, and several others around the world. And later there was one in Moscow. But there was some kind of a falling out with the people in the group. And this didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but it went through the courts. And a particular couple, made a complaint about them and went to court, and they won the case. So they won the rights to the Roerich Museum and all the contents. So all of his art and all of their notebooks from these Morya readings, which is very strange to me. And there's no explanation. All this information is on the internet, so I got it mostly from Wikipedia, but doesn't give any explanation as to why that would have been found for that couple and not for the Roerichs. So that went on, and that sort of broke things up. And then, let's see if there's anything else. They would transmit the messages. And these came through as clairaudient, not telepathy.
Right.
So I believe it was Helena who would be getting the messages, but it would come in as, what some people call clear hearers. They would actually hear a physical voice in the head. So she did. Mm-hmm. And then she would transmit the information to the students.
So that was kind of popular during that time, right? I mean, there was a lot of seances, a lot of channeling. I think that maybe was right around the same time the Golden Dawn activity was happening.
Right.
You had people like Yates and Yates's wife.
Right.
Yates's wife, you doing that whole series of channelings. Have you ever read that stuff?
Long time. I read some of it a long time ago, and at the time it didn't make a lot of sense to me.
It's really very difficult to read and get through.
So at the time it didn't really, I didn't connect with it, So that kind of leads to this, to Henry Wallace being, a close confidant of FDR, being a follower of Roerich. And supposedly, I've heard, at least from a couple of different sources, including the book from the Roerich Museum, so I guess it's canonical, that Roerich was the one who suggested to Henry Wallace that the reverse of the Great Seal of the United States, now the Great Seal of the United States is the eagle with 13 laurel leaves in one talon and 13 arrows in the other talon, and then there's the stars and stripes behind it. But there's a reverse of the Great Seal, and the reverse of the Great Seal, which goes back to, I believe, 1785, if I'm not mistaken, is where the eye in the pyramid is. Mm. And so Roerich, I guess, somehow is from either through Wallace, sees the reverse of the seal and says, "Why don't you put this on your money?"
Right.
And Wallace suggests they put it on, I think it was $1 coin, but FDR wanted it more, I guess, in circulation, so he had it put on the back of the dollar bill.
Right. So
Roerich is at least somewhat responsible for that being on the back of the dollar bill, which 1935 was when that happened.
Do you remember when you first looked at that as a kid, that dollar bill? And you asked yourself, what the hell is going on here? Do you remember that moment?
Yeah, what is that all about? What is that all about?
What is going on here, man? This is right? I want to know more about this.
What does that have to do with America, right? So you have the the new, and you got New World Order, and then you have my Latin is lost. Annus Corpus, which basically means, at least according to the makers of the seal, that we're a work in progress, and that God is with us, and God is overseeing this work in progress, which is the United States.
The great work.
Heading towards this New World Order, which I'm hoping was different from the people who founded the country than, say, when George Bush mentions it, in 1990 or whenever it is he said it. I'm hoping that the people who founded this country had a different thing in mind, than that.
And that does go back to John D. and that time.
Yeah, and got co-opted. So Wallace and FDR send Roerich on this another expedition, and at this point he's in his 50s, so he's kind of old for this kind of trekking across Tibet. And the restated reason is that I guess it was during the Dust Bowl era, so he was supposedly looking for drought-resistant grasses.
That's right. Yeah.
So he's traveling, but Roerich is really looking for Shambhala.
Right.
And then at some point, we can talk briefly about Shambhala, but at some point then, it gets called off, and Wallace all of a sudden repudiates Roerich, and he just kind of falls out of favor. It's really unclear why, but what happened to Wallace was that he wrote these letters to Roerich, and he said, and they were titled "Dear Guru," and Guru simply means teacher, in the Indian language. It'd be like calling Christ Rabbi. It's on that kind of level of thing.
Someone who leads you from darkness to light.
But Right. So that was all used against Wallace, especially when he ran for president, which was after Roerich died, but not long after. So there was a split there, and then Roerich, as Krys said, Roerich had trouble. And then they accused him of tax evasion in the United States, which is how you get rid of pretty much anybody you don't like, as far as I know. I hate to side with the IRS on anything, So my default issue is that they screwed Roerich over, so until improved otherwise. But anyway, they took it to court and they lost. So he ends up, I guess, spending the rest of his life in India. Dies in 1947. His wife stays on in India. So in the meantime, he paints these absolutely glorious paintings, and some of his best ones are from the Himalaya. Now, is that something that's up now? Or?
Yep.
Okay. So this looks like Leh, which is the capital of Ladakh, which is in India still, but it's a Tibetan Buddhist, one of the few places where Tibetan Buddhism is allowed to remain. But he painted churches. He painted these unbelievable Madonnas. I don't know if you want to bring up the Mother of the World, or
I wanted to do this other
or whatever you got. We can kind of riff on it, Robert.
Yeah. So can you see this one?
I see the one that looks like the mountaintop, which I think is which he probably painted in Leh.
You share here. Here's this one.
They call that the Little Patala.
Here's one where it looks like Buddha is in this fantastic ice cave.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this is
meditating at the heart of Shambhala or something like that.
Right, right. So that's another theme. So there's always this theme of this longing, of this lost wisdom, and the fact that it's found in these obscure places. So Shambhala, which he was looking for the physical Shambhala, I believe his disembodied teacher, Moria, was saying, don't look for it in the real world, but apparently he couldn't help himself.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so they're always looking for this entrance into Shambhala. And of course, every culture has its, form of Shambhala. The Sufis would call it Mount Kaf, K-A-F. Valhalla,
Bali
Olympus.
High for the Polynesians.
Right. I think for here it's called Branson.
What?
Branson?
Yeah.
Say it again.
Branson, Missouri.
Branson, Missouri, is that it?
For America. No, it was a joke.
Is that where?
Sorry, I had to take us out of Hyperborea for a moment there.
Okay.
Yeah,
It was
Hyperborea.
esoteric. We couldn't figure it out.
Yeah, Hyperborea is another one. So it's always, and it's usually in a cold place, an isolated place. That one's actually that image is of Muhammad, if I'm not mistaken, and one of his visions. So Roerich was, you got the crescent moon on it too.
But there's this theme in his work, which is obviously this quest for the mystical and the meeting with like the great teacher or the great spirit or some kind of, sort of transcendent moment where there's this, transmission of knowledge or wisdom that takes place. And I think he, eventually became that person to some degree with Wallace. Like one of the things that he claimed to have had was something called the Chintamani stone.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And the Chintamani stone is apparently a stone from a star, right? It came from, a distant star, landed, and part of the Chintamani stone is supposedly in the Kaaba in Mecca.
Oh, is it?
So that's one version of of Chintamani, and he supposedly had this other piece of it. And I think what might have happened with Wallace and Roerich is that he called Roerich out on producing the Chintamani stone. I don't think Roerich could do that. And that's just my hunch. I don't have anything that actually states that, equivocally. But I think that's my sense, is that he saw him as not being the holy man or the teacher that Wallace was looking for. But I think ultimately that's who Roerich became. He became that figure that he was seeking in these these desolate, quiet, silent, mystical places. He created that himself. He became his own creation in some ways.
Well, it would be nice to think that was the case.
Yeah, and of course, it's impossible to tell from here. And we've of course run into more than one person in this lifetime who started off as a seeker and became somebody who, were maybe not as fully enlightened as they came across it being. I don't know how else to put that, without naming names. But
I think you put it pretty well.
So this is the big danger with any type of spiritual acquisition, especially spiritual experience. Especially drug-induced spiritual experience, because a drug-induced spiritual experience, as important as it can be, is one that's done without sometimes, not always, but often it's done without work on yourself. And if you're doing that without work on itself, the ego just gloms onto it, and it's me who had this experience. It's me who's special, et cetera, et cetera. So whether or not that happened to Roerich, I don't know, but it's a pattern it's the most dangerous. It's a dangerous thing. It's called spiritual
appropriation.
Well, yeah, something like that. Spiritual appropriation, spiritual ego.
Oh.
Basically, it's called a spiritual ego.
Yeah.
And the spiritual ego, as someone who may or may not have suffered from that at some point in his life, is the toughest to eradicate. In my experience.
Yeah, I would agree.
So maybe something like that happened with Roerich. Because you got, how do you deal with all that if you're not, if you're not there, tuned into divinity, then all these things are just all these people, guru this, oh, you're so wise, we're all suckers for it,
Yeah, and I think he kind of falls into this category of people like Gurdjieff and Uspensky, primarily Gurdjieff, and an amazing kind of cataloger of human experience and psyche, and the underpinnings of what motivates us, fear. I mean, Gurdjieff was brilliant that way. But of course, there are all these exercises that were set up for people, and walking long distances with your head down,
and the stop exercise.
Yeah, I mean, so there were all these things that were set up, but one of the themes that shows up in Gurdjieff and some of these other self-appointed gurus' lives is that they can't take people from like one state to another. It's like when you read Yogananda, there's some of that. Yogananda delivers a blow to somebody's chest. All of a sudden they go into samadhi. He's actually able to do that.
Right.
But one of the knocks on Gurdjieff was that he didn't have that. Like he could get you so far, and that was fine. And I'm not even sure that was his responsibility to flip a switch and have people occupy an alternate reality or see themselves, in kind of a, eternal gaze. But I think Roerich is kind of in that camp, and there are a few other American characters. Not just Roerich, of course, Roerich is Rush, but there's a guy by the name of Paul Brunton. I don't know if you ever looked into his stuff. Another kind of self-styled guru and kind of this synthesizer of these different traditions. But clearly, Roerich is influential in a way that even I don't think Gurdjieff was that influential. I mean, he co-creates the Rite of Spring, which is really it's the starter's pistol for the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And everything after the Rite of Spring, I think, unfolds in a very interesting fashion. And some of it actually has a lot to do with chaos and primal energy and war and
right.
Connecting from sort of the Judeo-Christian yoke. It's a major event. It's the beginning of atonal composition and the splitting of the atom and all that stuff. It's a very important piece. And so Roerich's got his fingerprints on that, and he's got his fingerprints on the money, which is a big deal.
That's a big deal.
Symbolically. So he's very influential in the 20th century. Krys, you I think you might have something to share about this Mother of the World painting.
No, I was looking more at the Pax Cultura.
But I'll say,
Steve,
I don't know if you can't get to the bottom of it. So there's two figures at the bottom of this painting. One is holding a chest, and the other is holding up a book.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes back to the Buddhist conception. You have to have knowledge and compassion or wisdom. You can't have one without the other for attainment within Buddhism. And
I just want to interject that there's a really good article right now in Tricycle Magazine on that exact topic. Okay. So just wanted to say that. And
the other thing to notice about this painting, one, it's called The Mother of the World. She's veiled, which harkens back to Isis. Isis is always veiled, of course, and the goddess is always veiled except to her initiates. And then you can see also the circles. So you have one circle is centered on the heart of the Mother of the World. And the second circle, interestingly, is not centered on the third eye, and it's not centered on the top of the head, but it's centered on that dot above it, which is in sort of in the obscure, one of the obscure chakras in yoga, which is between the third eye and the crown chakra. It's called the Soma chakra or the moon chakra. And Soma, of course, is the brew that Indra takes in the Rig Veda, and that is taken by the Rig Vedic priests. Some sort of entheogen, still no one knows what it is. Even in the Rig Veda, they say it got lost and they had to use substitutes. But anyway, so it's kind of interesting that the Mother of the World has this circle from the moon chakra, which is something I've not ever seen before.
Right.
So, and the other thing you can see, and then on her outfit, you still have these ancient primal patterns that just go way back into, in this case, tribal culture, Scythian culture, ancient Russian tribal cultures, things like that. So I love this. We have this hanging this on my office. She overlooks all of our deeds here.
Well, aesthetically, this I think this is a very different kind of painting for him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's got
number one. It's not taking place in some grand vista, some mysterious hideaway, Shambhala, or someplace tucked in Tibet or the mountains in Afghanistan or something. This is like close up, and it also reminds me a little bit of an Art Deco kind of feel.
A little bit. And I like that it's not angular and hard edge. It's soft and round and very feminine and very personal.
This is a really interesting painting.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is one at the Roerich Museum that you can just sit and spend the afternoon, hang out with.
Fall into it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really, again, in person, these paintings just have a presence that is really, really just wonderful. And I don't know, did you want to talk about the Peace Pact?
Sure.
The other thing we haven't gotten into was what was called the Roerich Peace Pact, and he was here you go. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize a number of times.
I think like 4 times, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, I didn't know it was 4 times.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So this painting is called Pax, P-A-X, Cultura. So the peace and surrounding culture, how high art and culture can foster peace. And so they actually had this pact that was drawn up, and I tried to look for the exact number of countries who signed onto this pact, but it was, in my mind, it was like 120 countries. And then I couldn't find the number again.
Is this a UN thing? Is that right?
Well,
pre-UN,
it wasn't
35.
United Nations.
UN.
But it was, all of these countries signed on to this pact. And some of the big ones were like the whole South American quadrant. They were very big on this, and India was very big in this. So this symbol that you see on the banner that she's holding up, and it's always this sort of, not burgundy, but like a maroon color. It's not exactly red. It looks red in the photo, but it's like a burgundy, or very rich, deep burgundy with the 3 dots in the middle. So now that is supposed to represent art, culture, art, science, and religion, and then held within the circle of culture. And then you could also see it, you can interpret it like yogically as past, present, and future, held in the eternal now. There would be many interpretations of it, but their focus was on art, religion, and science, all held and protected by this circle of culture, that would foster those qualities in people. And so this was, the painting is reflecting that pact. And then as Steve was pointing out last night, it's also reminiscent of like the Renaissance art where you have the vista through the windows and looking way out into the distance, and how it would affect far-reaching land. So
so it connects back to, in this particular painting, he seems to be connecting back to like Renaissance Madonnas, where you'd have those vistas far in the background. But you should tell what the pact was too about what it was protecting. It was in the terms of war and all that.
Yeah, well, it started out like in 1904. He first proposed it to the Society of Architects in Russia. And then in 1914, he brought it to Tsar Nicholas II and the Grand Duke Nicholas. And they were very interested and really wanted to implement it. And then World War I broke out, and that completely put the kibosh to it for then. And then in 1929, it was promulgated in New York to codex into international law. So it was actually put into international law, and the pact was signed by many, many different countries. And then he was later in 29, that same year, he was nominated for the Peace Award. And then it was signed into law in 1935.
But did you explain the point about war and how it was, the whole point of it was to preserve?
Okay, so the whole point, and I thought this was kind of funny. The wording in the pact was that, so it was I think they got their inspiration from the Red Cross, so that there would be this understanding internationally that when you saw this banner of the Red Cross, you would go in, they were there to do humanitarian work. And so they were granted neutrality and protection. And so they envisioned this in the same way, that this banner would be displayed on works of art and culture, like it would be lovely if it had been flying over the Baghdad Museum, where it would be honored that this is something that is sacred to all of humanity, and that you would respect that as a human being, that would resonate with you, and you would protect that. And so the wording was very amusing to me, because they said it actually was, it would help with the belligerents of war, with the belligerents who were waging war, to raise to a higher level of consciousness and not destroy. Not destroy the art. And I think of the Taliban, how, I'm sure the banner would have kept the Taliban from destroying all those great works of art, but that was the ideal.
Well, it was a noble idea.
It was and you have to do it. But regardless whether it's respected or not, it's just the act of implementing that and saying that and making that statement, putting it forth into the world, that gives the human heart the ability to rise above what's going on an intellectual level. Mm-hmm. So it's going more toward the heart center and bypassing the intellect. So that was the whole idea behind it. And then he was, ultimately honored by being nominated for the Peace Prize.
Yeah, he actually considered beauty as a weapon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, he's a Libra.
Uh-huh.
That's it's the martial application of Venus, right? I mean, that's kind of what
that makes perfect sense.
Oh,
yeah,
that does.
And of course, with our publishing company, we're just all about beauty and it really is. It's kind of, I hate to say it as a weapon, but we say more or less homeopathic antidote.
Well, tell you what, next time when we get together, let's take your latest book that you guys have published, and let's look at some of the images and some of the pieces around that book just to show people the integration between the aesthetics and what you do and the actual content of the book itself. So
sure.
Something to look forward to next time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you, Krys, had something to
I
add?
just wanted to read. So in the articles of this agreement, Article 1 is where they mention the belligerents. And it just gave me a little giggle because they used that word. But they say Article 1 is the historic monuments, educational, artistic and scientific institutions, artistic and scientific missions, the personnel, the property, and the collections of such institutions and missions, above mentioned, shall be deemed neutral and as such shall be protected and respected by belligerents. And there are, 4 articles in the agreement. But I thought that was very innocent and lovely of them to say that.
Sounds very anti-Libra and belligerence. I don't think Libra sees itself as a belligerent force in the universe.
Yeah.
Well, this has been an interesting little trip down the life of Nicholas Roerich, and obviously he's been an inspiration in some ways to both of you because you always return to that building, right? When you go back.
We do. Whenever we're in Manhattan, we try to find our way over there, and we live with the art. And actually, I'll show this is the booklet that has all the information from the museum that has the articles in it and the pack and what have you, and stories in the New York Times.
And just for fun. This was really early on in our relationship.
Like in the 1980s, I guess, we had already visited the museum for the first time.
And I found this.
For my birthday, Steve found this in an antique shop. It's a beautiful pendant that has that Pax Cultura symbol on it.
That is beautiful.
Yeah, garnets. Beautiful red garnets. Yeah. We had to mount it on this paper.
What a romantic guy he is.
He's great,
I had my moments.
I just love him. Yeah.
Well, listen, we'll get together again.
Yeah.
Next month, and I know you guys have been getting into John D a bit. Maybe we can go off in that direction as well next time. What do you think?
Right. Well, yeah, we can sail to the New Atlantis.
Before we sign off, tell people where they can find more about what you do.
Go ahead, Krys.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, we are logosophiabooks.com, and we are located in the beautiful city of Asheville, North Carolina.
So if people are cruising through Asheville and they want to come to your house and buy a book, could they do that?
Or they could stay at our Airbnb if they like.
There you go. See, Airbnb, pick up a couple copies of
Airbnb. We have guests. We have as you might imagine, we have a significant library.
Right.
That we have some guests, they come and they think they're going to visit town. They just end up staying downstairs and reading.
Yeah.
Well, with all that rain you guys have had lately, there's probably a lot of that going on, right?
Yeah, it's raining again today.
So people can go to logosophiabooks.com, and please do, and we need the support. It's if you buy from the website, the author makes 4 or 5 times as much as they do when you go to Amazon,
and that means $4 or $5.
Yeah, as opposed to 92 cents or something like that if you buy a book from Amazon. So
there you go.
That's my plea.
Let's support our artists and our independent.
Bezos is doing fine, without us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So good to see you, Robert.
Great to be back.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
And we'll see you too in a month. And in the meantime, stay well, okay? God bless.
Okay.
You too, también.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right, that was Steve and Krys Crimi. Hello. Steve and Krys Crimi from Asheville, North Carolina. Talking a little bit about Nicholas Roerich from Russia. Speaking of Russia, if you are into the World Cup at all, Belgium just scored a stunning goal against Brazil and are up 1-0. And it was actually the Brazilian defender who kind of knocked the ball in. Not a good look for Brazil early in the match. Just a World Cup update. All right, that'll do for today's Friday FARcast. I'll be posting this over on YouTube with visuals. And I will be back on Sunday night for the Sunday night live stream with all the astrological information you're going to need to have for the week ahead. And you can find me at my website, robertphoenix.com, over at Facebook, Robert Phoenix. And if you're in Fredericksburg, look me up. I'm near the elementary school. All right, that'll do it. Use your head to discern what's real, your heart to stay open to what's possible. You've been listening to the Friday FARcast, and I'll be back next Friday with another guest with scintillating
You're listening to 15 Minutes of Flame with Robert Phoenix.